Hello and welcome to an Anomalous interview. I'm your host, Smiles Lewis. This is the first in a new series of anomalous interviews with anomalous people, researchers, experiencers, what have you. Our first guest is Professor Greg Eghigian of Penn State University. He is a professor of history and bioethics and is at Penn State University. He is the recent author of After the Flying Saucers Came, A Global History of the UFO Phenomena. We hope you'll enjoy this interview. And our patrons, if you join us at patreon.com/anomaly archives, get early access to these types of interviews. And then we make them public for everyone to enjoy. Hope you enjoy this. See you on the other side. Hello and welcome to an Anomaly Archives anomalous interview session. Our guest today is Professor Greg Eghigian, who I first became aware of back in, 2017 when I started seeing his blog posts about his inquisitiveness about the UFO phenomenon. And then I was even more excited when I saw his appearance in, I guess it's been 4 years now, to the 2021 August release of UFO from executive producer J.J. Abrams. And as much as I wish Greg was featured more in that, what I saw intrigued me enough to reach out, and then was so pleased and honored to meet him and hang out with him, along with our mutual friend Klaus Vaughn at the 2021 grand opening of the Archives of the Impossible at Rice University. I've often told people that hangout session was as much fun, if not more fun, than just the whole conference. Obviously, that's a hyperbolic statement, but I think you've probably said it yourself before that, sometimes it's the conversations that happen outside of these events that are even more significant than the events themselves. But AOTI 2022 was certainly a momentous event. And then, of course, you appeared as a speaker there the next year. And I think shortly thereafter, the book that we're going to talk about came out, After the Flying Saucers Came, the wonderful, amazing overview history of the global UFO phenomenon. I know we're not going to get to everything that I might want to talk about because I literally have 15 pages of notes. This, as slow a reader as I have become over the years, I do like to be meticulous when I find something that I can really sink my mental teeth into. And your book, much like Jacques Vallée's journals, is so chock full of little bits of amazing detail, information, I have just almost a note, almost page for page. So I definitely highly recommend folks check out your work in the form of that book and everything that you've written and or spoken about it. So I do want to start by noting the wonderful but brief dedication that you offered for the book, which reads, "For those donating their time and energy to preserving the records of the flying saucer era." And well, thank you for helping with that, with this work. Greg, I'm assuming that you're starting to write publicly about this in 2017 was a result of the New York Times articles and the kind of new renaissance that kind of was coming out at that time. Is that correct?
Actually, not really. I think that afforded me the opportunity to do it. But, it just happened to coincide with my getting a fellowship at the National Air and Space Museum. I was the Charles Lindbergh Chair in Aerospace History, which surprised a lot of my friends who said, "Since when do you do aerospace history?" And I said, "I don't know. I don't remember doing it." But I was doing research for, and working on this book there and meeting all these fabulous aerospace historians. And it was at the tail end of, I think, my stint there. And that's when the story broke in the New York Times and, of course, in other places as well. But I had already met an editor there, who the person who edited the Air and Space magazine for the National Air and Space Museum, and he had sort of heard me talk about my projects and said, I'd love to have you write some articles over the year, as we move ahead on this subject. So he sort of had inspired me to think about starting to write about this stuff, as I was working on it, and then the thing sort of blew up, as you say, in December 2017. So I began writing for them, and then that just sort of cascaded from there, because people saw that and said, wow, we're really interested in knowing a little bit more about what you're doing and what's going on. And that's how I fell into, all of a sudden, finding myself writing quite a bit for a lot of magazines and even some newspapers.
And am I correct that you did get some funding support in your research efforts?
Yeah. I mean,
NASA?
yeah, I got NASA, the American Historical Association, the American Philosophical Society, and of course, again, the Smithsonian. So I had a lot, and this again, I realize for people who aren't gray haired like us, the younger people, 2017 seems like ancient history. But the funny thing is if we remember very, very well that just the year before that, this topic was not on the radar, was not on the agenda of mainstream news outlets. So when I was working on this, a lot of people were like telling me, you're not going to get anybody interested in what you're doing. Nobody's going to want to fund this thing. And I was like, well, I'll give it a whirl and I'll see what happens. And yeah, was very, very pleasantly surprised.
So I'm also curious about how you set about uh, the actual raw on the ground research effort, because it's clear, and I know this from our conversation, that you went to these very rare UFO related archives. Of course, again, reflecting on that conversation between you and Klaus Von being like the leading world
Yes.
UFO material procurer for the archives for the unexplained over there in Sweden. And so I'm just kind of curious about, obviously your previous books and research efforts, you were already experienced at this process, and for folks who aren't familiar with how to do research outside of internet searches, if you could just tell us a little bit about those journeys that ensued as part of that effort.
Yeah, that's a good word for it, because they did involve a lot of journeys, a lot of trips. When I began the project, again, what any historian does is we're after archives, places that have holdings of things that are not widely disseminated, widely available, many things that aren't published, some things that are relatively private that you have to get permission to see. These are the things that I'm used to doing. And oftentimes the place you start to go for these things are through governments and places like that, or libraries, university libraries and academies and stuff. I kind of knew going in that, hey, a lot of those places don't collect this stuff that I'm interested in. So where am I going to find this? And particularly, I'm thinking to myself, where am I going to get access to private letters, or where am I going to get access to this stuff? The archival term for it is ephemera, right? Literature that is not intended to be permanent. It's the pamphlets and flyers and things like that. And that's when I realized, Greg, you've got to start talking to people who do this work. You've got to talk to people who are in the business of studying UFOs and see what they say. And that's when I discovered something that, you do, but that you also know very well, is that serious ufologists, serious UFO researchers are collectors. They're collectors. They keep things. And that I did not know. I did not realize just how many people have enormously fantastic private archives, right? And that was what I discovered. And so I started to look around, and that's when I came across and heard about the Archives for the Unexplained in Sweden. And this is before they were digitizing a lot. They had a few things digitized back in when I started out in like around 2014 and 15, but they didn't have a lot. And I wrote them and I said, I'd like to come and see what you have. And I was already in Europe, and so I got on a plane and found out where Norrköping was, which I had no idea about. And I met these fellows who I never met before, who took me in their car, took me out into this residential place, took me down into a basement. I mean, this is like literally in the first few minutes. And part of me is thinking, maybe this isn't a good idea. But I'm taken down into this basement, and they're just showing me this amazing amount of stuff about UFOs from all over the world. And what they did was they literally gave me the keys to the place. They said, help yourself. One of them cleared out a desk for me to work on while I was there. I spent like a week there, and it was just absolutely the most fantastic archival experience in my life I've ever had. I went back again and did it again, just to be able to have access to, and then of course the ability to talk to people who know what this material was and had worked there. So it was stunning. A lot of digging, a lot of stuff that wasn't necessarily organized. But through that process of going there and reading the stuff, and in some cases taking digital photos of stuff, that was the stuff that was really the building blocks of everything that followed.
I doubt there was any other such repository, with the possible exception of Rice. But were there many other special collections at universities or that sort of thing that you ended up visiting that helped out?
Yeah. Then I started when certain people had some records. So the American Philosophical Society of Philadelphia has the holdings of Edward Condon and the Condon Papers and the Condon Committee from the 60s. The papers of Donald Menzel, the great famous first great real debunker of UFOs. Phil Klass, who follows in his footsteps and becomes the second great debunker. So that was amazing material. Got access over at the University of Arizona, right, of the records of James McDonald, the great advocate for serious UFO research. So things like that became a way for me to do it. And then every now and again, I would have people who would share things with me, who had private archives. So ufologists who have really good collections, who would be willing to sit there and say, "Oh, I'll take some photos for you, or you can come by and pop by and look at." So I did the best I could with the time I had and all of that. And in the UK, I went over to Kew, over to the archives in London, where David Clark, the great journalist about UFOs, literally met me at the archives, and the man who put together all of the Ministry of Defense archival material literally met me there, took me into the reading room, showed me some of the stuff, gave me some photocopies. Those kinds of things were just like so special for me, because nothing like going to an archive, but nothing like going to an archive that somebody themselves organized. That's really pretty cool.
One of the things that you really delve into a lot and gave so much richer of a backgrounding than I'd ever experienced, and this really speaks to your explication of the global nature of this movement. There's just so many examples in your work in this book of all the different individuals, their groups, their newsletters, their evolution over time, their being shut down due to political machinations of the time. So much of that has such an international flair that it really feels like you must have made contact with either researchers in each of those countries, or I suspect that, again, the AFU probably, because it is so wide a field in its collection, that they have a lot of these things. But I'd be curious to know if you were able to get that from other sources than the AFU. This is not a paid advertisement for the AFU, but
yes, right.
but yeah, again, between them and AOTI in Houston, Texas, those are the two, and of course, David Marler's NUFO HRC in New Mexico. Those are like the three grand poobahs of archives.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, oh, definitely, definitely. I reached out to people, and you know what it's like. I mean, this is the other thing is everybody I talked to was always so welcoming for this uninformed outsider to sort of walk in and say, I'm really interested in the history of it. And what happened naturally was just I chat with somebody, I'd meet somebody, I'd talk with them, and they'd say, oh, you know who you need to get in touch with is get in touch with so and so. And then I would do that, and they would put me in touch with someone else. And through that, I got to get to know people again more internationally in that fashion. Sometimes I just introduced myself with an email, but many times people then found me because they said, oh, I'd been having a conversation with Mike Swords in Michigan, and he said you're working on this and you're interested in this, and that would just lead to something, right? So there were all, and this is where it's the veterans, it's the people who've been doing this for a long time, who are the ones who really walked me through all this stuff and steered me in directions and also warned me about roadblocks that I was going to encounter. So I could have been flying blind, but I wasn't, because all of these people, I had folks in Argentina and folks in Germany and France, in Britain, just all over the place, who were just so generous to me. Eduardo Russo, for instance, in Italy, has always been just, and everyone's at that center in Torino have been. Anytime I had a question about Italian stuff, I would get a not just a reply within just usually 24 hours, but a really extensive one with all sorts of information. That's the kind of stuff you dream of, right?
I'm so glad to hear that this community is as welcoming as it was to you. It's funny because certainly the UFO scene, especially in the social media era, doesn't always come across that way. Mm-hmm. But I think there is a real warmth when people sense another person who has a real legitimate interest in this, even if their belief systems are unknown or may contradict those of the person that's being inquired about. So I guess this is kind of an abstract question, but what makes UFOs so important that you felt compelled to go down this path? I mean, obviously, as a historian and a history professor, anything's, I guess, open season for interrogation, so to speak, and explication. But I'm curious to hear what makes you feel compelled about it.
Yeah, it's a really good question. I wear a lot of different hats as a historian, but one of them that I probably sort of own more than any of the other ones is as a historian of science and medicine. I'm really, really interested in how science and medicine are understood by not just scientists and clinicians, but by people, and how we interact with that world. But particularly things with people and things and ideas that are seen as just sort of eccentric or odd or unusual in some sense, or dangerous, things like that. I mean, because I've written a lot about those things in other kind of contexts. And so for me, as I sort of came across and thought more about this, and this was something I was interested in as a kid. I was always interested in UFOs, and I've always, to this day, still remained fascinated with not just UFOs, but just about anything involving outer space. I'm fascinated with space. But I thought to myself, when I started to consider a book, I kept thinking there must be a lot of people, historians, who've written the books. I don't need to write this book because it's been written. And then I realized I came across David Jacobs' book written in 1975. I said, well, a lot's happened since then. Um, Aaron Gulyas has written, I thought, a very good book on the subject that I quite like. But there hadn't been anybody who'd done a really deep archival dive about this thing. And I said, my God, this has been preoccupying us for decades. And surely there's something here that's worthy of looking at through the eyes of a historian, the way we like to look at things, which is not in this judgmental way, not in this forensic way of sitting there and saying, well, I'm going to be the one to prove X or Y, but rather to sit there and go, what is this preoccupation we have and the way we've been doing? What does this tell us about ourselves? How does this hold up a mirror to the way we think about what it means to be a human being, the nature of our science, the nature of our technology, the way we imagine the universe? That to me was what was really the thing that I was after, was to try to see what this tells us about ourselves. And yeah, there were a lot of things I was surprised by. There were a lot of things, and that's a good thing. It's good to go in and find yourself getting surprised. Otherwise, it means you're kind of stuck in one sort of mindset.
And there, I'm so thankful that you did this, and I really, again, I can't thank you enough for having seen your way all the way to the finish line and completed it. And I'm sure it must have been really frustrating at times, but it is a monumental work, and I'm not just trying to flatter you. I really feel you accomplished something that had not been done clearly. And like the example you give, the only previous book by a history professor was decades earlier, and some might say that was that person's most important work, and everything they did in UFOs after that is, like so much of the subject, prone to interpretation and cause for concern.
Yeah.
Um, like I say, there's so much in the book that I might want to pick your brains about, but and there'll probably be some things I will get to. But there is this one aspect that does recur, and it's obviously very much an aspect of this current resurgence post 2017, and that is this militaristic element. And obviously, this has been a hallmark of the modern era, from the earliest claims or concerns of government cover-ups, and dismissiveness, and the constant hypothesizing as to the origins, and the easiest being unacknowledged secret aircraft.
Yeah.
I was just reminded in preparing for this that your speech at AOTI 2023 was titled "UFOs and Alien Contact in the Shadow of Deception," which I remember when I first saw that, I was like, oh boy, I cannot wait to hear this, because like I said, there are these elements in the book, where whether it's the ghost rockets, where the authorities created a news blackout because of concern that it was going to cause some kind of a panic, to, of course, the oft repeated just conclusions of the Robertson panel being that this is a danger to national security, not because of the phenomenon itself, but because it could be used by other foreign adversaries as a way of jamming communications channels. And this, academics from a different perspective, not the governmental necessarily, though some would argue that some of that was instigated by these governments, this is a way of deluding the people, or getting them to think in terms of pseudoscience. And I think there's even, you at some point you talk about debunker Martin Gardner, who came out against Forteanism and his concern over political groups using such pseudoscience as happened with the Nazis.
Yeah.
So I mean, these are, and then there was another example of Argentina newspapers thinking that this was warmongering propaganda. You know, so there's this constant grappling with this in terms of deceit and deception, or whether again be it of a foreign adversary or just the idea of making making the weak-minded even more weak-minded. Um, is that really a theme that you felt you came across, or are those just data points that I'm just kind of like, oh well, they all similar?
No, I think you're spot on. No, that is, yeah, that's the record. It showed up pretty compellingly and consistently over time. Um, and I mean, it's become something of a truism to say that the modern UFO phenomenon, right, it was sort of fashioned and given birth to in the context of the Cold War, that the Cold War plays this critical role. I agree completely with that. I think there's no question. I might go so far as to say that maybe without the Cold War, we don't have UFOs as we know them. It would be a very different conversation we have. And maybe a good counterexample is to look back at the famous airship scares of the 19th century. When you don't have the Cold War, you have other kinds of war fears, and see how that played out very, very differently, right? So from my standpoint, I think the critical thing for me is to also, and I'm glad you mentioned it, is not to forget World War II's impact as well. There's the Cold War, but there's the shadow of World War II that is very much on people's minds in the late 40s and 50s. It ain't ancient history for those people. It's very immediate. And of course, World War II and the Cold War simultaneously give birth to is a number of things. They give birth to, first of all, the realization that governments have the ability to create enormous carnage, enormous mass destruction, and the atomic bomb is really the culmination of that. That gets to the second thing, which is the recognition that comes in 1945 that governments can have secret programs that can possibly endanger the lives of every one of us, and they can do things that would have been unimaginable, right? And then the third thing with that is also connected to it is that we have the age of big government. United States government, even 50 years earlier, if you look at what the United States government was, say, in 1900, it was a really, what you probably think about in comparison today, a Mickey Mouse affair. It was a small scale thing. You don't have this kind of massive bureaucracy and military bureaucracies, right? That changes. World War II particularly changes that, and the Cold War only really is a doubling and tripling down of that. So those three things together, I think, create the backdrop to this very clear, sort of almost immediate, as you sort of point out, this immediate turn to when there's talk of flying saucers, the immediate turn to this is a national security issue. Who's behind this? Who's doing this? I've written an article before I published my book. But the first actually article I ever wrote on this subject was on the early 1940s, late 40s, and 1950s reception of flying saucers in flying saucer reports in Germany, and that what was interesting there to see was that by and large the German media and German people all basically thought that this must be either the United States government, that was who they thought were the likeliest people behind it, or the Russians. And so the immediate place that people went to was to basically lean into the kind of things they were familiar with, which was getting bombed by Americans or Russians, right?
Yeah, there was. And this gets to just, I think, really what you do and do well as a historian is giving this grounding of a context of the time and the collective psyche of the people at the time in all these different locations. um I think it's early on in the book, and I think it is in the airship section where you talk about the first generation of folks experiencing the fear of death from above, this and the factors of rumor, xenophobia, and mechanized warfare. And this context dependent approach to trying to understand these stories, these because they're basically, as Greg Bishop has said, and others, it's the UFO is like a Rorschach block that we throw our unconscious and very conscious fears and expectations upon, and it's as much as you said, like a mirror for those kinds of things to understand ourselves. And I think it does also thus become prime potential territory for human agencies of all stripes to utilize for their own ends, which gets to areas that, we won't go into here necessarily. But I just, again, the personalized historical analysis that you give of these different groups and different countries, I just, again, it just really made me feel like I was peering through a time machine and getting a sense of what it must have been like. I mean, and it did very much mirror my own experience as, being obsessed with these things. My becoming obsessed with this with this subject when I was in high school, and how right out of high school, finding a MUFON group and participating in its production of ephemera, and that sort of thing. But you go back to, of course, as so many have, the Ray Palmers and the connection kind of to these sci-fi clubs. You mentioned Gernsback promotion of readers clubs and science correspondence clubs, and how that came to be the model for flying saucer clubs and newsletters. But again, just the volume of your explication of this in all these different parts of the world through different parts of time really impressed me. Of course, towards the end of the book, you really I was trying to go through my notes and pick out what do I want to talk about. I didn't get very far until I was like, oh my God, 1973 and onward. Oh my Lord. Like, how do I, fit all this in? But that's where it really gets, I think, really, really interesting, just because that's kind of like what the era that I grew up in, and I suspect you grew up in terms of, reading about these classic cases, but then as it was changing into this newer form with not just car chases and car stoppages and the occasional monster report, but like these close encounters of the third kind, these entity cases, and harkening back again to that UFO, that J.J. Abrams docuseries, your comment in there about the context of the rise of home invasion narratives, and as a possible stimuli, for lack of a better term, for this evolution or this change. Again, not a definitive answer, but just giving that context. And I think it was really apropos. And I think the rest of the book, as you explore more deeply that deep, rich, more recent history of the abductee phenomenon, and how so much of it was influenced by, say, the likes of John Keel and others, is just really fascinating. And I remember when we spoke that you were saying, well, that's kind of where your research was going. And then more recently, there was this Aeon essay that I think really did another great job of showing that process of how we assign importance and meaning to these kinds of things, these kinds of anomalous experiences. If was it, I'm trying to remember in one of your lectures, was it the Patty Price case, or was it a different case that you opened with? I think it was your Atlas Obscura class, maybe.
It might have been. It might have been the Patty Price case. I think that's the one that I go into a little detail with, right? With that's the one with Ray Fowler, right? Or was
Yeah.
that, or was that
Um,
with was that with Bud Hopkins? I can't recall.
Harder. I think Harder, and I think James Harder.
James Harder's involved with that. Yeah, James Harder. Yeah, I was that ex. I it, without question, I completely agree with you in many ways. I mean, I must admit I had so much fun, and I was just so fascinated by the growth of groups and organizations, and learning about some people who I hadn't known nearly enough about. Um, uh, uh, on that count, I agree with you completely. I just, that to me, I'm glad that it stuck with you, because I really really spent a lot of time on it and wanted to get it right. And just as an off to this side comment, um, uh, I came away thinking that I think Coral Lorenzen is one of the most fascinating people in the UFO world. And now that Dave Marler and co have all that stuff, we need a biography. Somebody's going to write a good biography. She warrants a biography. Um, but in any event, yeah. So I agree with you about the later chapters and this sort of darker turn that to me fascinates me. And I will say that it was also the one that I felt was going to be more challenging. Um, there is something um, uh, uh, what's the term? What are the terms for it? There's because of the nature of these experiences, these encounters of the third kind, fourth kind, whatever you want to call them. They themselves are experiences that are deeply personal. They have profound impacts on people's lives, and they are themselves invasive. There's an element in which I kept thinking to myself, how do I approach this in order to appreciate that, in order to analyze that, and to both simultaneously try to respect it, but to also do what the work of a historian is to do, which is to ask questions about how to see this within the framework of history. Um, and so I don't, I tried my best at that. I know that I've heard from some people who don't feel like I handled it properly. That is going to be what happens. I think whenever you historicize people's experiences, particularly profound ones, I think people find that to be either threatening or denigrating in some ways. And that is certainly not my intention. But I will say, I believe everybody's experiences could be historicized, including mine. So it was a challenge, but that I felt like that what I had to do was at least at some point, and I think that's what you're referring to with the Patty Price moment, is I had to dig into one of these instances and cases where I could look at this thing in action, look at actually how this got worked out. And that's when I, make this argument that I fully recognize is probably pretty controversial in some circles, that it strikes me that no given version or experience as it gets related is authored by one person. The experience may be a very personal experience by one person alone, right? But that the telling of it, the speaking of it, the bringing this forth into the world of other people, maybe even getting publicized or at least getting talked about, and that involves a collective process of numerous people. And to me, the stories are the key element, right? How do the stories get made, and how do they move around? And To what extent is a game of telephone going on, right, at times? Those are the things that I thought, that's what I can talk about, because the experiences themselves are, in a sense, inaccessible to any of us outside of that person. The only thing we have are the stories. And so to me, that's kind of what I wanted to do, was to try to get at what we can learn from the stories and how stories get produced and reproduced. Because that's what historians have been doing since, time immemorial, when historians have been doing what we do, which is to collect stories. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And you did a really powerful deep dive with that particular case. And what I really came away with was you touched on so many things that I had in observing and leading a local support group for abductees and UFO experiencers, witnessed time and again of that the challenge of that razor's edge of investigation versus caring, trying to be there and for somebody who oftentimes is basically a victim, a survivor of some traumatic experience, and hoping to help them without too overtly influencing them into one belief or another. Whereas so many of these investigators are trying to tease out the truth, the reality, the mechanism, the why, the what, the how, what exactly happened. And the best of them, apprehended this challenge of balancing that.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, this part where you go into so much detail about how even the Lorenzens and I think Harder, James Harder, were basically taking on, as you described, the aspects of the aliens and their mind control techniques, and treating, in the transcripts, Patty Price is describing feeling like she's a guinea pig at the hands of the aliens, but then by the end of it, it seems clear that she has become a double guinea pig at the hands of the investigators. And it's a tragedy, and you didn't shy away from the what I think is the most important thing to tell anybody about when it comes to this period of the UFO history movement, in terms of what was going on with the abduction phenomena, and how reprehensible, at least to my mind, and in hindsight, and at the time, honestly, because I was never an advocate for hypnosis. Once I understood more about hypnosis, and that's not to say anyone really understands anything about hypnosis, other than it is a powerful tool that we don't even really fully apprehend what it is. But yeah, I really appreciated that. And again, this deep dive history into like Carol Rainey and her connection to Bud and how that changed, and obviously it still created a lot of enmity in the community at large. But it just gets to these an element of, also it goes to so many other elements, like the issues of a white male dominated UFO community that you also touch on, and with the rare exceptions of in terms of the researchers, some of the most interesting and in some ways best abduction researchers and UFO investigators were women. But yeah, there's so many really worthy paths to explore there. And yes, Coral Lorenzen would be an amazing person to document. Well, I guess with the last 15 minutes or so here, I'm kind of curious to know where you're going with your current work, as well as what is happening in the UFO scene now that really attracts your attention, for better or worse, either that you think is a good thing or that you think is a bad thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, we'll start there, because that's the stuff that can get me in more trouble.
Oh,
No, I mean, yeah. So what I see, what's been going on more recently, it strikes me as not altogether different than things we've seen in the past. Um, I've said in some other occasions that in a sense we've gone in a straight line back to the beginning, where we the 2017 and up to Dave Grush at least, we were basically in going back to what are these things? What do they look like? How are they propelled? Right? It's the good old fashioned hardcore nuts, literally nuts and bolts uh, vessels or crafts or whatever they are. What are they kind of things? And then with the military element superimposed on top of that. Um, we then got what was probably inevitable, which was the disclosure. We demand disclosure. People are keeping secrets. People aren't coming clean. The government knows more, which I guess we could have expected. And then we started to have the, again, sort of recycling of these stories of captured aircraft, captured spacecraft, captured corpses or bodies, or again, sometimes I've been very confused as to what it exactly was that supposedly exists. But then also you get what again is very common, which is then inserted into those more contemporary narratives and claims are, oh, and by the way, this stuff has gone on since the 1930s, and we have stories. And this is when the veteran ufologists all come by and say, will nobody read what we wrote back in 1975 about all this stuff? That we knew then this was a problem, right? That this doesn't stand up to scrutiny. But all those things are not uncommon in history. One of the most common things, in fact, one of the common things in history is forgetting. Societies and people forget. Every generation reinvents the wheel. And so it gets frustrating if you're lucky enough to live older, because to an older age. But it is the nature of, I think, human beings in the way we operate. So things get forgotten. So in a sense, I sometimes look at everything I'm seeing and I see the same play with just different actors, different people playing different roles. We have a little more of the, for lack of a better term, the celebritification of ufology. We have, people who are stars in a way, who gain the spotlight, and whereas other voices maybe don't get nearly the same attention, who maybe deserve it. Um, so I think that's an element that has been, I think, accentuated in recent times. Social media only accentuates that even more. Um, we clearly still have hoaxing, we still clearly have rumors spreading. And again, social media only accelerates the spread of rumors because, attribution, who cares about attribution and things like that. So I think it'd be, I differ from my students who often feel this is the grand age where everything can be known. And everything can be exposed. I think we live in an age in which it becomes harder to differentiate the truth from fiction. It becomes more difficult to sort of navigate these things. So I, for instance, am a great advocate, and I realize I am tilting at windmills when I do this, but I am an advocate all the time among all of my friends and colleagues who do UFO research and UFO investigation, to slow down and take a long view of things. Don't get involved in the hype. Think about things and realize that any new knowledge you're going to get is going to take time for it to really warrant being called knowledge. All information is not knowledge. Um, so, you know, scientific knowledge, knowledge in the humanities, knowledge in history and philosophy usually is a slow process. We don't live in an age where people like slow, but slow is sort of necessary. So I kind of I usually take a big step or two back from things, and don't chime in right away. When people ask my opinion, I usually sit there and say, maybe ask someone else. I'm going to wait on and sit on this a while. And I think that's been proven right. We still are waiting on a lot of things that have been claimed to, bear fruit. And until we get to those moments, right now, it seems to me all we can do is just sit there and say, well, all right, we've heard these things, we've heard these claims before. Let's see if anything comes of it, or are we going to be just back where we were at the beginning, at the start of all this?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. It's it's easy to get sucked into wanting to offer one's opinion. That is what that's what social media desires of us, is our time and attention, and we really have conditioned ourselves to give into it far too easily. And I feel your pain whenever I see something that I'm like, again, won't anybody just read what's already come before? And it gets so frustrating. We are, a few days away next week from the latest UAP UFO hearing, and there was all this talk of finally getting quote unquote firsthand witnesses to testify, and so far it's looking like there's no firsthand witnesses. So it's just more telephone storytelling, which again, I think there can be value there, and we can triangulate that stuff. And this is where I think, again, people like Jacques Vallée have done such a service to history with their journals. With his journals, you can go back and look in his journals and find the earliest references probably to so many of the things that have come up in the last few years, not least of which was, like, say, the Admiral Wilson memo, and the evolution of that story, even, and so many of these things. I still feel like there's a kernel of truth here, and it just seems like, is Arrow really just obfuscating, or is it just that hard to actually penetrate this supposed, cover up? But there was something I was going to ask you about as we get towards the end here, and I'm drawing a blank.
No, don't worry about it. I know that feeling too.
But yeah, so are you actually, do you have a plan for a next book in the realm of UFO work? Or
I do. I am. I've got a book contract to write a history of the alien abduction phenomenon more generally. I felt like what I did in that chapter expressed a lot of what I wanted to do, but I realized that there was another set of things that needed to be done, namely to also fill in a lot more that couldn't be filled in, but then to also sort of talk about it in a different framework, and to look at more specifically the questions that were raised at the time by the claims of alien abduction, the challenge they posed to people from all kind of different walks of life, and why it was some people felt like they had to chime in one way or the other. Why was this, again, part of a broad general conversation in the public, in what way? That kind of, I felt, was what I needed. So that's one of the projects I'm working on, and I am also, it's still in a very developmental stage. I guess I can talk about it, but I may be also working on another book that looks at something else that was going on simultaneously with the alien abduction phenomenon, and that was the satanic ritual abuse phenomenon. I'd been approached by an editor who read that Aeon piece and said, I was really interested in what you had to say about satanic ritual abuse. And so I've been doing some work on that, actually. Um, and here's a question, if I can ask a question of you, because you know a lot of source material that I don't know. And this is where you've often been really helpful for me. It strikes me that that debunkers of both of these phenomenon, right, and clinicians and people, they often connected the two together. I'm thinking I can't recall just about anybody working on alien abduction and talking about it, or in the UFO newsletters and magazines that I read back from the 80s and 90s. I don't recall any of those folks even bringing up the subject of satanic ritual abuse. I mean, maybe there were people who were doing it, maybe people who saw them as connected, or maybe I kept thinking maybe there are people who said, "Oh, that stuff is nonsense. This stuff is real. What's going on there is all something else." But I can't recall ufologists and experiencer researchers even talking about the subject, let alone seeing a connection.
I'll say we'll talk.
Okay. Okay.
Um, what I can say right out of the gate is I'm pretty sure we were talking about it, because I know that. So when I was in the mid '90s publishing my ELF Infested Spaces Journal of Possible Paradigms zine, among the things that I was receiving gratis was the FMSF newsletter, False Memory Syndrome Foundation, the infamous infamous debunkers of satanic ritual abuse cases. And yeah, boy. And I think those of us who were already really concerned about the overuse of hypnosis and um, uh, overly zealous interrogation techniques, we're seeing the import of trying to understand the malleability of memory. And so some of us were looking and talking about that very thing. So yeah, no, I think that is a very important thing. And it reminds me, when earlier in the discussion I was going to bring up, I've just started watching this HBO series on the yogurt shop murders that happened here in Austin in 1991. An infamous, terrible crime where 4 young girls were brutally murdered, and they've never caught the actual killers, or at least no one's ever lasted as a confirmed suspect. And the show has gone off on a tangent about the nature of, how could anybody confess to such a horrible crime? And it gets to this idea of the malleability of memory, and how you can't imagine being coerced into doing this, and yet it happens. And as much as I would criticize people like Elizabeth Loftus, she's obviously the go-to person for explicating how malleable, in fact, memory is. But no, I think that's fascinating. I think the satanic panic and the abduction panic, in some ways, can absolutely be considered to go hand in hand. I've remembered what I was going to ask, and it's the inevitable question. And I'd be curious to hear if you're willing to even briefly touch on your thoughts on this, and where you might be when you finish these other projects. What does your gut, your intuition tell you is at the heart of these stories, at the heart of this phenomenon? Is there a phenomenon, or is this all just games of telephone told by people who've had some kind of experience? Is there a source? And I don't expect you to know for sure, but I ask, where do you feel, if you care to share?
Yeah. So I will probably give you an unsatisfactory answer.
Okay.
It is that not only do I not know what's behind it, I don't think it is knowable. I don't think we can even posit that there is a something. It could be some things. It could be nothing or nothings. You know, um, there's of course a something there. That there. I do think the fact that I'm I am part of, you know, I agree enough with those those very, I think, very smart, very talented people who wrote for the British magazine Magonia, right, back in the day, that there's no question, and Valet talked about it, of course, before a lot of people did as well, about this connection between this and everything to fairies and to elves and to mystical experiences and all the things that people like Jeff Kripal talk about. That is so universal that it tells us there's a something going on with human beings and their encounter and their experiences of something ineffable, something beyond. Um, my own view is that it is always going to be only known through a mediated means, through me using a metaphor to explain it, like we see today, right? People saying, you know what this stuff is? It's all like the Matrix, right? We always turn to it's a like this, it's akin to this. So I think we constantly fumble for these ways of trying to make sense of things. So for me, I think what it is it could be something that is something beyond human beings ontologically, that it is out there. It could well be just the nature of how human consciousness works. It could be, and in some occasions, my guess is it's like UFOs that are sighted, right? Sometimes they are balloons. Sometimes they are sleep paralysis. But they aren't sleep paralysis all the time. And they aren't just balloons all the time, right? So there's that element to it. So I guess for me, the thing is, and I remember talking about this with, I wish I could remember his name, when I was in Italy visiting the folks in Turin and talking to one of the great one of the great Italian researchers about abduction in Italy. And he and I both realized we both had come to the same conclusion, which is we don't know, and we're comfortable with that. I know a lot of people aren't, but I'm comfortable with this idea that I could still study and think about and grapple with these things, but come to the conclusion that I don't think will ever know. That there's just something that is just so difficult and impenetrable in that regard that it just sort of stands there. So it could be none of those things, all of those things, one of those things, some of those things.
Well, as I've often encouraged people, cultivate a high tolerance for ambiguity.
I agree completely. And I like living in a world of ambiguity.
And I encourage an agnostic approach to these things. And this is where, like, writers and thinkers like Robert Anton Wilson, I think, have profoundly positively influenced generations of people to entertain multiple ideas at the same time and not think of everything as being exclusionary. Go back to good friend Greg Bishop's zine, The Excluded Middle, and this idea from Charles Fort of intermediatism. All ideas are just intermediate understandings of the nature of things, and I do tend towards a pluralistic approach to this phenomenon. I think there's so many possible explanations, and many of them are not mutually exclusive. But thank you so much. I will be curious to ask that question again after you conclude these projects, but I suspect that still will be a valid answer.
Probably so. I'll let you do otherwise.
Thank you, Greg Eghigian, professor of history and bioethics at Penn State University. He's the author of After the Flying Saucers Came, A Global History of the UFO Phenomena, published by Oxford University Press. Highly recommend you get that book, add it to your collection, dive in, take your time with it, digest the many amazing stories and details that encompass this decades long how long till we have the century anniversary for the modern era.
I know.
Is there any particular place folks can find your work?
Oh, I think I'm pretty easy to find if you just do a good Google search. I mean, I'm not as probably you might suspect after what we just discussed about social media. I've found myself more or less sort of pulling a Homer Simpson into the bushes when it comes to social media. Finding it a little better for my mental health. So but you'll see pieces that I've written that will pop up pretty quickly if you just Google me. And you can also typically find out what's going on with me if you visit my department website. You just go to the history department at Penn State University and find me there. And you'll usually see something about what I'm up to, what I'm teaching and what I'm writing about and things like that.
Well, great. And folks can go to anomalyarchives.org where we'll have a page dedicated to information about Professor Eghigian and with links to past lectures and articles that you'll find helpful and interesting. Thank you so much, Greg, for joining us.
Thanks. This is a blast. Always nice talking with you.
Yeah, man, I'm so glad there's somebody like you and hopefully more of you out there. Stay with me after the jump. And everybody, thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.